Hi everybody, this is Miss Huval. This video is for English 3 AP. This is a literature video. We're going to be delving into the Harlem Renaissance and some poetry from that time period. So, in order to be able to follow along with me, you are going to need copies of the poems that I'm discussing today. They can both be found in your gold literature book that you checked out at the beginning of the year. If you can't find that, or if you don't have one, I also posted all of the poems on JPAMs in a Word document under the Harlem Renaissance. Okay? Also, there's study questions for the poems as well. So pause me now, go and find your book, or pull up that document from JPAMs, and then we can start talking about the Harlem Renaissance. Thanks. Okay, guys. If you're back, I'm assuming that you now have a copy of these poems in front of you. If you're in the yellow textbook, we're about on page 846. That's 846. And if you are in the Harlem Renaissance packet, you need to flip to where you see Claude McKay and James Weldon Johnson. Claude McKay, James Weldon Johnson. The two poems that we're going to cover today are My City by James Weldon Johnson, and If We Must Die by Claude McKay. All right, in the book they're 848 and 850, and they're in your packet under the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, we got two words that we've heard before. Harlem, which you know is a neighborhood in Manhattan, and Renaissance, as you know, is the French word meaning rebirth. So the Harlem Renaissance happened in New York round about the 1920s. Okay, 1924 was the initial kickoff, but many of these poets were writing well before that time period. So what happened with the Harlem Renaissance is that you had all of these societal pressures coming together, very much like they did in The Great Gatsby. You had the end of World War I, which was a time when people really started to believe that all innocence was lost. It ushered in a time of hedonism. We remember that word as meaning the pursuit of pleasure as a way of life. Ruthless business practices, and you learned all about that in American history. The haves and the have-nots, the Gilded Age, these robber barons, all that kind of stuff. The tremendous takeoff of the stock market. So a lot of wealth, a lot of poverty, and a lot of political corruption. All right, so we've got the World War I aspect of it. We kind of learned about the Jazz Age a little bit. Prohibition was a societal force that was exerting a lot of pressure. And the Jazz Age, which you remember F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of coined that term, it was the music, it was the attitude, it was the women and the way they dressed and the way they did their hair. And, you know, the 19th Amendment played into all of that too. So we had all of these societal forces coming together. There was also something that we didn't really talk about that too much with Gatsby, and that was consumerism and the mass media. But that had a profound effect on everyday average Americans. Excuse me, I'm not sick, don't worry. Pollen is still getting me. So the Harlem Renaissance came about during the same time period as Gatsby, and also as a result of all those different societal pressures coming together. So the world was changing. It was changing at a very rapid rate. The Jazz Age was all about rebellion and escapism. The illicit alcohol had a really big part to play, as well as this amazing new form of music, which took the country by storm. When we talk about consumerism and we talk about mass media, advertising became a big thing. And so many technological advances and so many new things were coming about. Ready-to-wear clothes you didn't have to make yourself. Sliced bread that you could buy at the store. So it wasn't a whole morning of baking. You just buy a loaf of bread. Things like that. made the lives of everyday average Americans easier and allowed for more free time, more of the pursuit of recreational activities. And also during this time period, which the Harlem Renaissance became a part of, was advertising. And so not only were these items available, but they were mass marketed in a way that they hadn't been before. And so that leads to the classic keeping up with the Joneses, right? You get a washing machine. Wow, did you see Miss So-and-so's washing machine? And again, that saves you hours and hours of time. So that's kind of the time period that we're looking at. Another really important societal force specific to the Harlem Renaissance was called the Great Migration. And that's when sharecroppers and farmers from the South left for the urban cities of the North, looking for opportunity. And as a result, we find ourselves with great concentrations in these big urban areas of Black families who are pursuing college educations and becoming shopkeepers, merchants, ascending into the middle class. And as a result, the flowering of poetry, art, drama, novels, short stories, journalism on the part of the Black community began, and that's what's called the Harlem Renaissance. It was specific to New York, but it was happening all over the country. Okay, there were people you've heard of, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson. Maybe you've not heard of James Weldon Johnson, but you've definitely heard of the Urban League, the National Urban League, and the NAACP. Those organizations were created about this time, and they used to publish journals. And in the journals, they would publish poetry, short stories, plays, works of art by these artists, poets, playwrights from the Harlem Renaissance. And that's where they really found an audience for their work. Okay? So the poets of the Harlem Renaissance, they span the gamut. Okay? They had, there were men and women who wrote about the Black experience exclusively. There were men and women who, like James Weldon Johnson, who said for a people to be taken seriously as a people, they have to create a body of art that is specific to them. So James Weldon Johnson was big on fostering these Black poets and artists, visual artists, as well as dramatic artists and musical artists, because he felt like if there was a body of literature that was specifically representative of the Black experience, that would help to improve things for race relations even. There were also people like Langston Hughes who didn't believe that he had a responsibility to represent the Black experience in any way but the way that he experienced it himself. And his great belief was that if we could see each other as people, the good, the bad, the ugly, if we just could see each other as people, that would go a long way to improving race relations. So you had people all over the board. Langston Hughes went to college, but he didn't finish. A lot of these other guys and gals from the Harlem Renaissance were extremely well educated. You have Countee Cullen, who's one of my faves, who was a Harvard grad. You had Claude McKay, who we're going to study today, who was an immigrant from Jamaica, who came here to go to college and then stayed. Arna Bontemps came to New York, but he ended up spending most of his life in the South and writing about the Black experience in the South. So the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance spans all of those different kinds of people and all of those different interests and goals. Some of it is about race relations. A lot of it is not. It's just beautiful poetry that speaks to us on a human level, which all important and beautiful poetry does. So the two we're going to read today are sonnets, okay? Now, I don't know if you remember about sonnets. We read a few last year. We read Shakespeare, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? We read Elizabeth Barrett Browning, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. We also read one by Edna St. Vincent Millay, which is probably the one you'll remember most. It was the one that said, love is not meat or drink. It can't save you when you're drowning. It can't mend a broken bone. In the end, though, she said, love is essential to life, even though it's not essential to life. So all of those were about love. Now, the sonnets we're going to read today are not really about love in the real sense, which sonnets typically are about love. These are a little bit different. So let's just review what a sonnet is. Sonnet, of course, is always going to have 14 lines, and it's going to be on iambic pentameter. Of course, iambic pentameter has to do with the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables and the number of syllables in each line. So an iamb follows the pattern unstressed, stressed, and it has 5 feet. So that's where we get the 10 syllables. 5 sets of unstressed, stressed syllables. So iambic pentameter, and that's in each line. Okay. Also, it's got to have a specific rhyme scheme and a specific setup. And the way they're described is Italian and Shakespearean. So, if you remember, a Shakespearean sonnet is going to have 3 quatrains. That is 3 sets of 4. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. And that's the rhyme scheme. And then it ends with a couplet, G, G. 2 lines that rhyme. Okay? An Italian or a Petrarchan sonnet has 1 octave. A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A is usually the rhyme scheme there. And then a sestet, which is 6 lines at the end. And there's some variation in the way the CDs go at the end. And sometimes there's even a CDE in there. But if it starts this way, A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A, most likely you're looking at an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. So that's just a little review on what sonnets are. Of course, we love sonnets because they are a beautiful, beautiful way to express in a very structured manner and in a very familiar manner. Okay? So the first one we're going to look at today is My City by James Weldon Johnson. If you take a look at page 848, that's where his is. Or you might have to flip through the packet if you've got the packet. All right? So I'm going to read it to you. It says, My City by James Weldon Johnson. When I come down to sleep, death's endless night, the threshold of the unknown dark to cross. What to me then will be the keenest loss when this bright world blurs on my fading sight? Will it be that no more I shall see the trees, or smell the flowers, or hear the singing birds, or watch the flashing streams, or patient herds? No, I am sure it will be none of these. But Manhattan's sights and sounds, her smells, her crowds, her throbbing force, the thrill that comes from being of her a part, her subtle spells, her shining towers, her avenues, her slums. O God, the stark, unutterable pity, to be dead and never again behold my city. Okay, so in that one, we've got this beautiful expression of his love for Manhattan. Okay, so he starts out saying, when I die, what am I going to miss the most about being alive? Is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? No, it's going to be never being able to behold the city again. So that's the overall gist of the poem. And he uses the sonnet very specifically to break that into 2 parts. So he's got the 8 lines, then he's got a break, and he's got the 6 lines. That seems to be the Italian or Petrarchan pattern. Now his rhyme scheme is not quite right because he doesn't do A, B, B, A, B, B, A. He's got instead night cross lost sight, which is A, B, 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 A. But then he starts over with trees, which doesn't rhyme with anything that came before it. So we go C, D, D, C. But it's the same pattern, all right? And it does have the octave in the sestet. And it is completely divided into two parts. The first part of the poem, he's asking, what am I going to miss when I die the most? And then he answers that question in the last 6 lines. But it's really neat to look at the way he puts this whole thing together. For example, he says in the first part, Manhattan, he says, what am I going to miss? And he's got these very typical images of nature. And they're not very flowery. They're not very filled with figurative language. He says, the trees, the flowers. Take a look at line 5. The trees, the flowers. We got singing birds, so he adds a little bit there in line 6. Flashing streams, gets a little more fancy there. Patient herds, okay? So these are very typical images of things that you would see in nature. All of them are lovely, but he says he won't miss them. And so he phrases them not using his absolute best description. Okay, he saves that for the sestet where he talks about Manhattan. And the words that he uses in that section jump off the page at you. First of all, the images are powerful. Manhattan is personified as a woman in the second part of the poem. He says Manhattan's sights and sounds, her smells, her crowds, her throbbing force, as though she's got a heart beating inside of her, throbbing inside of her, and you can feel that force throughout the city. The thrill that comes from being of her a part. And you have a little inverted word order there, for him to be able to keep up his iambic pentameter most likely. So it's not only a joy, it's not nice to be around her, it is a thrill. All right, the shining towers, her avenues, even her slums. So it's not just the beautiful parts of the city that he loves, it's every part of the city. And when he mentions the smells, cities have some good smells, things cooking, baking, all manner of delicious things happening, but particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, you probably also have a good amount of bad smells in a city. All right, so that's James Weldon Johnson and his poem, My City. Now let's take a look at If We Must Die, which is on the next page, on page 850. You might have to flip in your packet to find it. This is by Claude McKay. He's called the Poet of the Revolution. Poet of Rebellion, not Revolution. That's Thomas Paine, right? He's our firebrand of the Revolution. Anyway, Claude McKay is called the Poet of Rebellion. He wrote this particular sonnet in response to the Red Summer of 1919. Across the country, there were 26 very, very bad race riots. And he wrote this poem to comment on them. It became quite a rallying cry for the black community. And Claude McKay kind of lamented the fact, I think, in his life that this became his most famous poem. Because all of his poetry was not about race relations or riots or anything like that. Not even about, even a little bit about that. But this became his most famous poem. Okay, so let's take a look at it. It says, If We Must Die, by Claude McKay. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So not your typical subject matter at all for a sonnet. Definitely not, but a powerful sonnet nonetheless. Let's look at it first of all. There's no break like James Weldon Johnson had. It's all in one. Let's take a look at our rhyme scheme. Okay, hogs, spot, dogs, lot. That seems to be ABAB, which would be Shakespearean. Question is, do we have 3 sets of those? 3 quatrains. And if you take a look at it, we do. And then we end with the couplet. So the format of this sonnet is more the Shakespearean format. And so let's look at what he's saying here. He's describing to his reader a pretty hopeless situation, right? They are pinned up, backs to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So the fight they found themselves in is pretty much a hopeless one. They don't really have a chance to be victorious. But he says, even in the face of this sort of adversity, what we have to do is fight like men. Okay? So we've got 2 images of him and his kinsmen, of us, the us in the poem. All right? We could die. All right? So he's saying, if we must die, how are we going to do it? 2 ways we could do it. We could do it like hogs, that simile in the first line, like hogs. Or, he says in line 13, we could die like men. We could nobly die, spilling our precious blood. Line 5, he says nobly die. Line 6, he has precious blood. So the choice is this. Do we want to die like hogs, or do we want to die like men? Okay? And this is what he's advocating for, dying like men, fighting back, taking out whoever and whatever we can take out on the way. All right? Now, so how does he describe the oppressor here? How does he describe his adversary? Well, we've got the metaphor, 2 metaphors. A pack of mad and hungry dogs, line 3, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs. And then he also describes them as monsters, line 7. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. Okay, so his adversary is described in 2 very, very charged metaphors. And then at the end, again, back with the dogs, line 13, like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack. All right? So in this particular sonnet, he advocates not for winning. It's not whether you win or lose. It's how you play the game, to Claude McKay here. And the way he plays is to not be flat-footed, to fight back, to resist injustice. And in so resisting, you may die, but your honor will be intact. And even the people who hate you, he says, even the monsters we defy, shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. Okay? So that's another really nice sonnet there. Kind of a militant message, and still a beautiful, beautiful poem. Okay, I'll be back with more Harlem Renaissance poems for you in the days to come. I hope you have a good one. Hope you're safe and well. I miss seeing you. Bye-bye, everybody.